بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
The first Muslims did not use concepts that you use today. You use flawed and innovated concepts that were not used by the first Muslims. You talk about matters that were not discussed in the first centuries of Islam. You describe Allah in new and problematic ways. The first Muslims did not describe Allah in such a way. This line of argument was stated by a popular Muslim speaker. This video will not be a refutation of the brother's comments. He is merely reiterating what is commonly said. Although the way he articulates this critique is simplistic, inflammatory, and problematic, but to be fair, on the surface, it is a reasonable critique. It cannot easily be dismissed. The problem is, this critique has been stretched. This critique states that Muslims that describe themselves as Ahlul Hadith or Athari are a new sect because they use terms and concepts that were not used by the first Muslims. There is only a partial link between this group and the first Muslims. This is their argument. However, something crucial is being missed. We are missing the bigger picture. This video will outline crucial factors that need to be considered. There is a phrase said by our African American brothers: what is understood doesn't need to be explained. Meaning, when there is an understanding between us, there is no need for a long explanation because we are all on the same page. The reason why the Salaf do not talk like how we do is because they did not need to. The ways in which we describe and teach the religion in the 21st century are more extended, fuller, and more drawn out than they were in the first centuries of Islam. This is because in the 21st century, we are more in need of longer and more detailed explanations. This was not the case in the first centuries of Islam. Those early communities had a deeper, more profound understanding of the religion. In 2023, we receive much of our Islamic knowledge from study, extensive reading, but for those early communities, this knowledge was part of their lived experience. It was embedded in their interactions, and key events that we read about today were part of their memories. For many of us, Sahih Bukhari is just a book on our bookshelf, but in those early communities, they were men and women that were walking, talking, breathing Sahih Bukharis. Their level of understanding was so high that very little needed to be explained to them. Every generation thereafter needed more and more explained to them, to the extent that in 2023, we need every single thing explained to us. In fact, we need everything over-explained to us to bring us closer to the understanding of those early communities. For example, in 2023, when we envision a sock, we envision the socks that we see today. So there has been some contemporary discussion during the ablution process. Can we wipe over the socks if our socks have holes in them? This is a fair question, but it takes someone to hold our hand and explain the socks that we wear today are not comparable to the socks of that earlier period. Why are we focusing on a simple hole in our socks? Were not the socks of the first Muslims anything but tattered, ripped, patched? Imagine what socks looked like in that early period. It must have been the norm to see socks with holes. Socks were ripped, tattered, patched together, made from different materials, ill-fitting. This has to be explained to us because we are so far removed from their realities. But for that first generation of Muslims, it was the norm to see socks like this. It was understood. So you will not see extensive commentary on the condition of their socks in that period. One more example, the Quranic expression, Ya ayyuhalladhina. To us, it may just be an oft-repeated expression that we see throughout the Quran. But to those early generations, the significance of this expression was understood. When they heard this expression, it demanded their attention. They straightened their backs and they were in alert mode because they knew whenever this expression was mentioned, an important command would follow. This was intuitively known by them. This is not to say that the first 3 generations were magical beings that acquired religious knowledge through osmosis. No, they still had to strive. They still had to memorize, like we do. But they had the advantage of context. Context is everything. Without context, we lose the nuance. And many things go over our heads because we do not have a direct relation to the narration. Everything needs to be explained to us. We can almost trace the development of scholarly commentary, which was minimal at first, then gradually expanded with time. For example, we begin to see Islamic texts with portions of the Quran and prophetic narrations. Beyond this, there was little need for extensive commentary in these early periods. Later on, we start to see chapter headings. These chapter headings were not just a way to organize the text, they were well thought out. Scholars would communicate their stances through these small chapter headings and even refute other scholars through these chapter headings. Then we begin to see texts with more scholarly commentary. Minimal commentary at first, because as I said, what was understood did not need to be explained. There was not much need for extensive commentary. And even this early commentary was merged with expressions extracted from prophetic narrations and Quranic verses. Then we start to see texts with substantial commentary. As Islam expanded into strange lands and innovative practices grew, more commentary was needed, more explanation was needed, refutations were needed. Ultimately, we see the sharh. The sharh is an exposition of a previously written text. So a scholar takes it upon himself to further explain and expand the work of a scholar from the past. Perhaps we may see a sharh of a text. This is the level of explanation that we require. With the growth of scholarly commentary, we may see analogies, expressions, and conceptions that were not used explicitly in those early communities. In 2023, all of what we say and do in our religion goes back to these early communities. But how we write about the religion is not completely identical. There is significant similarity, but it is not completely identical. For instance, the implication of the Shahada and acting according to the Shahada were known and deeply understood by those early communities. The significance that the Arabs gave to oaths, pledges, and testimonies was renowned. 1,000 years before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, the Greek historian Herodotus stated that the Arabs kept pledges more religiously than almost any other people. Though it is doubted that Herodotus traveled to this region, he relied on Persian and Egyptian accounts that marveled at the Arabs' observance of oaths, testimonies, and pledges. Such a culture of observance reduced the need to write extensive scholarly commentaries about the significance of the Shahada, but in later times, there is a need to. Trust me, we are in need of lengthy commentaries that explain the significance of the Shahada. For instance, in order to bring us closer to this original meaning of the Shahada, scholars have conceptualized that there are 7 conditions to the Shahada. So it may be said that you people are overstating the significance of the Shahada. The writings of the first Muslims did not dwell on the Shahada like you people. Moreover, your conceptualization of 7 conditions is not found in the writings of the early communities. The construct of 7 conditions is not found in the Quran or the prophetic Sunnah. We would say, yes, this is true. The exterior of our conceptualizations would be unfamiliar to those early communities, but the interior would be recognizable to them because these conceptualizations did not come out of thin air. They are derived and developed from traditional sources. It is just that the medicine administered at that time was minimal because the sicknesses of the ummah was minimal. But in our time, we need to increase the dosage of the medicine because the sicknesses of the ummah are life-threatening. The Salaf's approach to understanding the Quran and Sunnah dominated the first centuries of Islam, and as a majority, there is little need to talk at great lengths. The approach of the Salaf is referred to as Ahl al-Hadith or Athariya, which mean adherence to prophetic narrations. There is a consensus among Muslims and even non-Muslim historians that Ahl al-Hadith or Athariya formed the majority of Muslim societies in the first centuries of Islam. Their dominance is seldom contested, and as a majority, they enjoyed many privileges. Amongst those privileges is the lack of a need to justify your dominance, because it is self-evident. You are the status quo. You are the uncontested inheritors of the religion. You are the norm. As the majority, you do not need to talk about issues at great lengths. You do not need to constantly validate yourself. You do not need to defend yourself. Rather, the minority is the one that is on the defensive. On the odd occasion, when the majority is challenged, the reply of the majority is often dismissive. It is short and straight to the point. No elaboration is needed. A mere warning from this majority was enough to exile individuals who articulated their alternative beliefs. This is because At the time, challenges to orthodoxy were seen as exotic, oddities, something that happened on the fringes of society. It was so absurd that individuals would suggest an alternative understanding to Athariya. A contemporary example would be the absurd claim of the Nation of Islam that Allah is a black man, arm, leg, arm, head. This is absurd. This claim is contrary to the majority of Muslims. We wouldn't even entertain a discussion on this topic. There is very little need to dignify this claim with a refutation. How many books have been published refuting this concept? Very few, if any. However, the dominance of Athariya began to erode. The ruling classes began to support and promote scholarship that took a more rational approach to understanding the Quran and Sunnah. This was contrary to the more literal approach of the Athariya. Ironically, the expansion of these rational groups was also due to their minority status. Let me explain. As minorities, the rationalist groups were compelled to validate themselves. They were constantly on the back foot. They were often in defensive mode. They had to justify their positions. They were not afforded the luxury of being a status quo because they were bringing something new to the table, which was unknown to the masses. So they had to work diligently to perfect their arguments, put forward a coherent vision of this new way of thinking, all of which produced formidable rationalist minorities. So, unlike the Athariya majority, the books of these rationalist majorities were filled with the words of men, paragraphs upon paragraphs of men trying to work things out, men seeking to Islamicize foreign and alien concepts. Yes, these books contain selected prophetic narrations and Quranic verses, but this was minuscule compared to their Athari counterparts. Nonetheless, some state that the rationalist movement superseded the Athariya majority around the 11th century CE. I believe this date is too early because we still have writings in this period that indicate the minority status of rational approaches. Scholars who advocated rational approaches were very frank about their inability to galvanize the masses. Their lack of popularity was not seen as something shameful. Rather, it was a badge of honor that their rationalization of the Quran and Sunnah was so intellectual that it was beyond the grasp of the common people. For such reasons, we can assume that this rational approach sat comfortably with the ruling classes, and it was forcibly promoted by these elites. Eventually, rationalist schools of thought dominated the Islamic discourse. This remains the case to the present day. Though we can't say for certain when this change occurred, what we can say with some level of confidence is that from the 12th century CE, Athariya was no longer privileged. Athariya were now compelled to validate and justify themselves. They had to over-explain and defend their religion at greater lengths than they did before. They had to produce voluminous works, distinguishing the authentic creed from newly invented conceptions of the divine. They had to deconstruct and critique critical Greek philosophy that had crept into the Islamic discourse. All of this indicates the pressure from a growing rationalist movement which marginalized and mischaracterized the Athariya way. Athariya were minoritized. Their claims to the authentic creed of the early generations were discredited. The current majority of rationalist groups continue this dismissiveness. These people are Wahhabis. These people are anthropomorphists, Mujassima. They are uncultured literalists. They are harsh, Neanderthals, outside of the tradition. The current majority of rationalist groups are dismissive, full of contempt and disregard towards the modern day Athariya. It is important that the current majority need to ask themselves 4 questions. Question 1. When those who adopted the more rational approach spoke about themselves as a minority, who were they a minority to? More specifically, when the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya spoke about themselves as a minority in the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries Common Era, who were they a minority to? The Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya, seeing themselves as a minority, indicate that they acknowledge a significant difference between them and the main body of Muslims. So who was this main body of Muslims and what was this main body upon? Question 2. Why were those Muslims that adopted the more rational approach initially a minority? This is a question that requires contemplation. Remember, this minority status can only come about if something new was introduced that differed from what was there before. Question 3. Is it better to be a majority from the first centuries of Islam or the majority in this latter period of Islam? Question 4. Were the Muslims in a better state when Athariya was the majority, or are the Muslims in a better state now that the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya are the majority? In summary, we may slightly depart from the language used by the early communities because we are compelled to over-explain issues. We do not have the privilege of being understood, and we do not have the privilege of being a majority. Context is everything. The language used will have differences, but the sentiment is the same. And mistakes will happen. We find ourselves on new ground. We are facing new challenges. We are embedded in new cultures. We are over-explaining issues in a variety of foreign languages, in a variety of foreign contexts. So we may overstep the bounds or make problematic analogies. I may make such a mistake in this video. Even our scholars may make the odd mistake here or there, but Ahlul Sunnah should give each other the benefit of the doubt. We should recognize that we are all trying to align our understanding with the understanding of those early communities.